Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Aurora Rojer, the host for today. I am the vice chair of the local DSA chapter. And today we have with us Genevieve Rand, a local labor organizer.
Hello.
Welcome, Jen. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I have lived in Ithaca for a few years now. I moved here after graduating, unlike a lot of people. And ever since then, I've been either working in the service industry or organizing the service industry and helping with the low wage type of labor organizing that's traditionally been left out by big, larger business unions.
Awesome. It is so great to have you with us today. So we are talking about the Ithaca rent freeze in today's show. Can you tell us what is
Yes.
the Ithaca rent freeze?
The Ithaca rent freeze is a request that the city of Ithaca institute an amendment to its emergency section of the city code that will allow it to restrict collection of rent during a declared state of emergency, which essentially what that means is that the city would step in and forgive rent for everybody at once until further notice.
Mm, cool. So what's the difference between a rent freeze and the eviction moratorium that we already have? Why would we need a rent freeze?
Right. So right now, if you don't pay rent, you can't get evicted. New York State instituted an eviction or a moratorium on evictions. And so until June 20th, there aren't going to be any evictions happening. On June 20th, there will be evictions happening. Anybody who misses rent during this time is then going to still owe it when June 20th hits. And a lot of people are unemployed. A lot of people are financially struggling right now. So when that moratorium is up, we're going to have a lot to deal with regards to housing. So the rent freeze is the next step after getting that immediate moratorium on evictions to try to make sure that as few people as possible get to June 20th and then are punished with homelessness for the economic crisis that made them lose their jobs.
Beautiful. Beautifully explained. So why did you and the folks you're working with decide to focus locally instead of like a statewide or national campaign?
There's a couple answers to that. One of them is that we are trying to run as bottom up of this campaign as possible. Right when the COVID-19 crisis hit, there were almost immediate $1 trillion bond bailouts for large financial institutions. And from there, there have been measures of varying degrees of aid for, again, large financial institutions, for large businesses, for small businesses, for people with mortgages. But when you are trying to get aid to the people who are most vulnerable, you don't have the same infrastructure opportunities for that you do with large financial institutions on the other side of things. And so if you're starting from the bottom up, you have to start with what you can immediately control and change, and then continue to expand outward from there, rather than the other way around, where you start big and then help the small people. So in accordance with that, we recognize that we have the closest proximity and the most control over our immediate local government. And our hope is that whatever we can achieve at the local level will then build the momentum of our organizing and hopefully inspire change at a county level, at a regional or state level too. It's just sort of laying that foundation.
Cool. Very cool. So one of the tactics that the campaign has used was a phone zap. Can you tell us more about what a phone zap is and how you chose that tactic and why and how it went?
Yeah, this is the first time that I ever participated in something like that. All the time we hear call your legislator, and then we don't do it because we have the feeling that it's really not going to do anything. And that was kind of how I initially felt with this, was that asking nicely generally is not the way to achieve something. At least you are going up against the interests of like large financial institutions, large property management companies, and some smaller landlords too. But when those two groups, you and wealth and power, are fighting with each other, nice requests don't intuitively seem to do a lot. But going back to talking about organizing at the local level, we have very close proximity to our local legislators, and we have a little bit more connection established with them that we can use a phone call to sort of invoke. And given that our local legislators are like known people, they're people who we interact with throughout town, they're people who we have met before, who we've sat in common council meetings with before, since anyone in the public can attend. And so we decided that asking nicely, essentially, was a reasonable first step for trying to get some kind of rent relief achieved for the most vulnerable people in the city. And it wasn't necessarily that we were just asking nicely. There was definitely some pressure that got put on them too, because when you're a local legislator and your constituency is the city, it's a very limited number of people who are put in a position to elect you. So the idea was that if we could get enough people participating, and we could reach out to enough of our like networks and the people we know who have similar jobs to us, who live in similar housing to us, that would actually represent a significant portion of the electoral base of those politicians. Whereas if you were to try to do that at the state level, it would be many, many millions of people that you would have to organize to represent like a reasonable portion of a legislator's electoral base. So in addition to being sort of the first step, is that you start by asking, you see if that works. It often doesn't, but you kind of can't skip that first step. Additionally, if you ask on the scale that we asked, where you have thousands of calls coming in and keeping people's phones occupied all day, you have the opportunity to demonstrate to them that there is democratic support for this within their electoral base specifically, and that they have, most of the people who are under them asking them to do something as a representative, versus like a few calls for somebody who represents tens of millions of people.
Yeah, I think I love hearing you say that was us asking nicely, because I think the legislators might disagree that it was nice. Can you talk a little bit more about what exactly the ZAP was, how it was organized? How did you get thousands of people to make calls in like 1 week? And what is a phone zap? How is it different from just calling legislators as individuals?
I'll start with the last part. How is a phone zap different from just calling legislators? Because anybody can do that. Anybody can send a letter, an email, a text message, some of them Facebook messages. Getting in contact with a legislator is one thing, but a phone zap, I don't know who came up with the term, but what that means specifically is that you make enough calls that it presents some sort of inconvenience to the people that you're calling. So in this case, that was making thousands of calls that kept their phones, which now that we're all working remotely, are already more important to their like communication from a work perspective than usual, essentially occupying those in the ways that we are able to, all being stuck at home right now. So we planned very carefully the schedule of the calls and who was going to be making them at specific times, so that we could most effectively ensure that we were reaching as high of a call volume for the specific people as possible. So, and to note, it wasn't unfortunately thousands of people making calls, but it was hundreds of people making calls. And we just had each person call their legislator once a day, and hopefully try to have an ongoing conversation with them over the course of those days, although many legislators immediately stopped listening or responding to people's calls. But yeah, the whole idea is that it's not just making your voice heard, it's joining together as a unified, coordinated effort to make your voice impossible to ignore. And that's something that I think we achieved pretty effectively. The Common Council meeting, even though we didn't get the piece of legislation that we want, the majority of the meeting was talking about the fact that none of them had been able to use their phones for the last few days because everybody was demanding that we take a specific legislative action. So as far as the organizing step of the Phones app, I feel like this was very successful, and I'm super grateful to everybody who took up responsibility for coordinating and scheduling and touching base with all of the volunteers. Working together as a group of hundreds of people is not easy, especially when you're not giving into the same sort of authority structures of like a business or something. So it was a really awesome project of hundreds of people just coming together and staying in touch and figuring out how to communicate and act as a unified front.
Yeah, and as one of the lead organizers, how did you stay in touch with hundreds of people every day?
I didn't talk to hundreds of people every day. That's what's great about this, is that none of us had to do that slog of like making hundreds of calls to other people, asking them to make hundreds of calls to other people. We were able to organize it so that in general, each person who stepped up to volunteer in the organizing part of it was keeping in touch with around 10 other volunteers. We divided that up by electoral ward since we were specifically targeting elected politicians here. And so we had this structure of each person is in contact with 10 people, and then all of the people who are in contact with 10 other people then also come back and have conversations and summarize the things that they've heard from their peers, given that they have the time to sort of have those conversations with everybody, and are dedicating their effort to summarizing it and making sure that everything is conveyed in both directions throughout the organizing and the actual action. So there were like 20 people who took on those positions, and many of them ended up with more than 10 volunteers working with them by the end of it as more people joined throughout the days of the Phones app. But it was entirely due to the efforts of those people who all shared the burden of coordinating and scheduling and everything that this happened, which is extra exciting to me because it represents an actual like solidarity based movement rather than just a really coordinated like funding blitz or mass hiring for phone banking or something like that, the way that say a political campaign would do. This was really a giant group of people spreading the responsibility among everybody and each chipping in to try to get this accomplished.
That's really powerful. How did it feel during the campaign to be a part of that? Did you know from the start that it was going to be that big?
No, we were super shocked at first. At first, we just made the petition, like a couple of us, after sitting on the citywide organizing calls that like the mayor and a bunch of like nonprofits and things were doing. And we were like, well, we're talking about all these ways we could put money in people's pockets. What are ways that we could stop it from coming out? And we were like, how many people would support suspending rent during this time? And we made a petition and it got well over 1,000 signatures in less than 24 hours, which for a city that's like got 20,000, 25,000-ish people left maybe after all the students went away, that's a pretty big number. And then we got even more signatures the second day than we did the first day. And so we were like, oh, there's actually widespread support for this. That was, I think, the biggest surprise, having worked in, not worked, but having volunteered in organizing for a long time, is that in order to generate response and interest, it often takes a lot of effort by some very dedicated people. Whereas we put this idea out there and just basically putting up a petition and making a Facebook page, thousands of people were engaging with it and saying like, yeah, this is a really good idea. So that was super exciting, having worked on much smaller scales for a long time. Actually making the calls on the days that we were doing the Phones app was more of a frustrating experience, because rather than having, you know, thousands of people say, yes, this is an amazing idea, it was trying to call these 10 people over and over and having them all say, this is a stupid idea, like, this is terrible, or just ignore us completely and not respond to us at all. Or even one common council member showed up to a girl's house to like continue arguing with her after their phone call ended. There was, it was a little more like talking to a wall during the actual event. But the reason that that was bearable was because we had already built that sense of solidarity with thousands of people. And having that be a collective process where even when like one of the Common Council members called me and started harassing me, I didn't feel alone at all because I knew so many people were having the same experiences.
Yeah. And what was your structure for sharing that kind of like we're talking against a wall, but we're all working collectively? How did you communicate with one another during the ZAP and stay in touch and stay up to date and address talking points?
It's difficult to stay organized and coordinated when you're in a crisis situation that's urgent. It's much easier when you have a deadline way out in the future that you're building towards and you have plenty of time to plan in advance, and you can start 3 months before doing like surveying and building your base. In this situation, we literally built it as we flew it. Like, I can't emphasize that enough, that we were coming up with new methods of organizing and coordinating pretty much every single day. And it was a challenge. I don't know how we pulled it off, to answer your question directly, but it involved sticking to the general principles that everybody can participate in every single part of it. And I think the fact that we were having like these organizing calls where we were planning, okay, what are we doing next? And it wasn't just like a steering committee that was doing that, for example. It was tens and tens of people on any given call who were participating, sharing their ideas, and deciding where the campaign was going to go next and what we were going to do next and how we would prioritize our energy. So I think that it was a momentum thing where just enough people participated in the conversation that we were able to, between that and our very like essentially like 2-level structure of spreading out communication by one person talks to 10 other people, that through those things combined, we were able to stay in touch. Some stuff fell by the wayside and things always get lost in the weeds. Yeah, we built it as we flew.
Awesome. So cool. And I saw you also put together from, in those nightly meetings where people would debrief the phone calls, like this beautiful document emerged of like frequently asked questions.
That's true. We documented everything.
Yeah. So can you talk about what some of those people who didn't want a rent freeze, and those were the Common Council members? There's also a lot of people in Ithaca, not as many as want the rent freeze, but there is a loud minority of folks who did not want a rent freeze and were very vocal about it on Facebook and whatnot. Can you talk about the landlord response and what your response was to the landlord response?
Yeah, so in reaching out and like hitting walls, whether it was with legislators or with landlords, we, like everything else, kept record of that and took seriously, like, what are these people saying? How can we, from not just immobilizing the people who already agree with us, but organizing the people who might be more skeptical, how can we deal with that productively? And the way that emerged was that we would just collaboratively like keep track of this information and talk about the issues and brainstorm ways that we could respond that were consistent with sort of the principles that we were operating under. When we had conversations that hit walls, whether that was with a legislator or a landlord, the objection was generally the same, which is that if people stop paying rent, then landlords are going to be in financial trouble. Landlords could lose their businesses. They could have to sell them for extremely low prices and be in really tough financial situations. And while I want to remind people that even though the very small landlords are very numerous, the number of properties that are owned by small landlords is a much smaller portion of the overall properties in Ithaca. They, like many cities, there are massive property ownership conglomerates that would bear the brunt of the hardship here. But other people who are working class, who maybe have a second building or have split their home into a duplex in order to be able to afford their mortgage, for example, there's a very real presence of folks like that in Ithaca, where property taxes are so high and affording a house can be difficult. So we definitely wanted to keep everyone who's in that position in mind. The basic operating principle that led to every single thing that we did in our campaign, whether it was pushing for renters or pushing against landlords, was that nobody should have to go homeless or not have other basic needs like food and medicine met because of the COVID-19 outbreak. Or at least we should try to prevent as much of that as possible. And so it sounds a little bit harsh, but when it came to the inevitable conflict that happens when you are pushing against a system that has people in it, like do we have beef with those people who are in the system? It was when those interests conflict, landlords versus renters. What it comes down to is that having shelter is a human right, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others who participated in this. Owning your own business is not a right. In nearly the same way, I think that everybody should have the opportunity to own their own business. But when it comes to, are you going to get sick? Are you going to die of exposure because you don't own your own business? Probably not. Whereas if you don't have a place to live, you're at much greater risk. And so that's why I distinguish between those two things. And the unfortunate thing about an economic collapse is that somebody has to deal with the fallout of that. And the way that it is right now, a lot of the people who are ending up dealing with the majority of the pain are people who are very low income, whose landlords can threaten them, whose jobs could fire them, and so on and so on and so on. People who are undocumented, people who were working under the table and lost those jobs, people who lost their jobs before the coronavirus hit. None of those people are covered by the existing federal aid, even for individual people, because it requires that you file for unemployment, which requires that you are actively searching for work and can't find anything. And every other aid that's happened has some kind of means testing to it, even with the stimulus checks. If you're in debt to your bank, they can take your stimulus check away from you. So the most vulnerable people are bearing the brunt of the pain and will continue to bear the brunt of the pain as evictions start to happen. Just to compare that to the other side of things, like I mentioned earlier, immediately, like day one, large financial institutions were getting $1 trillion bailouts from the government. And then shortly after that, New York State put a way to defer your mortgage payments for a few months in place. And which, even though it's deferred, you're still paying into equity that will end up in a home that you own. And then there were measures put in place for large businesses, and then there were measures put in place for small businesses. And the messiest, most unreliable rollout by far has been the aid for the poorest and most vulnerable individuals. So in deciding, like, how are we going to address this, that has continually been our focus, is like, who is the most at risk and who is experiencing the greatest hardship. That's where we start. Mm-hmm. And then once we have those people's situations secured, even the people who can't qualify under means testing, even the people who don't have enough trust or interface with the government to fill out an application, how can we make sure they're safe? And then once we've secured that, then we move up those strata of socioeconomic privilege to try to then help renters who can't afford things, then to try to help homeowners who have mortgages that they need to pay in order to keep their homes, and so on and so forth. It's just like, you start at the bottom and you work up from there.
Awesome. So there were thousands of people that signed the petition for a rent freeze in Ithaca. There were thousands of phone calls made by hundreds of people. How many common councilors ended up changing their minds?
I mean, TBD, but
during the
zero of them.
Yeah.
Zero
And
of
how
them.
many of them are renters?
I think one of them, it might be more.
Yeah.
I know the mayor's a renter. He's been
Right.
talking about that a lot.
Yes.
But he's not a common council member. There's like a slight difference. But yeah, one of them is a renter. A couple of them are landlords. Seth is a landlord to his wife, right, according to what he told me on the phone. And lots of Common Council members are business owners
Yeah,
who would complain to us that our calls were making it hard for them to conduct their business over the phone,
yeah,
which was frustrating for us because our unemployment was making it difficult for us to conduct our business just in general.
yeah, seriously. So that is a little window into the class interests of some of our representatives. What's next?
Yeah, so in addition to still having some conversations with legislators and trying to make something happen, we met with the mayor earlier today and we have a follow-up meeting scheduled there. Beyond that, we're really trying to bring the organizing beyond just trying to talk to people who are in legislative positions of power, because they've shown what their interest in stepping in is. So it's kind of time to take things into our own hands. And we're starting to do outreach to figure out what people are experiencing with their landlords right now. And given that we have hundreds of people ready to take action, it seems like there's a lot we can do for the people who are dealing with the worst from their landlords right now. Like people who, like I mentioned, people who are undocumented. I know somebody who's a sex worker whose landlord has been threatening them with police attention if they don't pay their rent. Like dealing with all these other forms of leverage and of hardship that can be inflicted on people without getting the government involved is something that in Ithaca, a group of hundreds of people can do. So that's what we're looking to next. And we hope to continue to try to push the city to do something as everything continues to unfold, but also more immediately try other routes of achieving relief for renters.
Including a tenants union, right?
Exactly, yeah. We partnered, I mean, the Ithaca Tenants Union was key to the whole thing happening in the first place. They were right there from the beginning, making the campaign happen. And they have served as sort of a host for us to continue our organizing to other endeavors, like mapping out the city of Ithaca and who owns what, and so on and so forth. And we're continuing to build the membership of that, and every new person that joins it is another person who can act collectively to try to help the most vulnerable people in our city.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Aurora Rojer, and I've been speaking with Genevieve Rand of the Ithaca Rent Freeze campaign. Thank you.